The sky was not just dark that evening, it was heavy, swollen with clouds that seemed ready to split open at any second. The streets of the small southern town lay quiet, save for the occasional clap of thunder rolling over the hills. Street lamps flickered, neon signs buzzed and sputtered. It was the kind of night where you could feel the weight of the storm in your bones before the first drop of rain even fell. Inside, a weather-beaten diner at the edge of town, warm yellow lights spilled across rain-streaked windows. The old place was modest, a long counter with faded red stools, a row of booths patched up with duct tape, and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. Yet it carried a certain charm, the kind that whispered of long nights, strong coffee, and stories exchanged over slices of pie. Behind the counter stood Grandma Ella, a woman who had seen her share of storms. In her late 70s, her hair wrapped in a colorful scarf, she moved with the steady grace of someone who knew how to keep things together when the world outside threatened to fall apart. Her hands, roughened from decades of work, poured steaming coffee into chipped mugs. A pair of truckers sat at the counter, boots muddy from the road, shoulders hunched against the weather. "Looks like we're in for a bad one," one muttered, stirring sugar into his cup. Ella gave a small chuckle, though her eyes lingered on the darkening windows. "Child, I've lived through storms that rattled these walls harder than a freight train. We'll be all right. Just keep that coffee hot, and the thunder can holler all at once." Another bolt of lightning cracked across the sky, so bright it lit up the diner like daylight for a split second. The truckers exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered, almost to himself, "Feels like more than just a storm's brewing tonight." The words hung in the air, heavier than the thunder. Ella turned away, busying herself with stacking fresh plates, but even she couldn't shake the feeling. Something about the storm felt different, less like weather, and more like a warning. The air carried a strange tension, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck rise. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, rattling a loose sign on the diner's porch. The bell above the door jingled every so often, not from customers walking in, but from gusts pushing against the old frame. Ella glanced at the clock on the wall. Almost midnight. Too late for families. Too stormy for travelers. The diner should have been emptying out, but she stayed open. She always did. You never know who might need a warm meal on a cold night, she used to tell her late husband, and she believed it still. The storm slammed harder. Rain finally broke loose, pelting against the glass in sharp sheets. Lightning struck again, closer this time, making the truckers flinch. The power flickered, then steadied. One of the truckers stood, pulling his coat tighter. "Ma'am, I think we're gonna find a motel before them roads flood. Appreciate the pie." He slapped a few crumpled bills on the counter, and both men shuffled out into the storm. Their taillights vanished quickly into the night. The diner grew quiet, too quiet. Ella leaned on the counter, listening to the relentless rain hammering against the roof. She hummed an old hymn under her breath, trying to calm her own nerves. But even as the tune filled the room, her eyes kept darting to the windows. Then, from somewhere beyond the roar of the storm, came a sound that didn't belong. Low, at first, almost hidden beneath the thunder, but growing louder, steadier, unmistakable. Engines. Not just one, several. The deep, rolling growl of motorcycles cutting through the storm. Ella's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Her heart gave a little kick against her chest. She walked slowly toward the window, peering out into the night. Headlights pierced the sheets of rain, weaving together like a pack of wolves circling the edge of town. The rumble grew louder, closer, until it vibrated through the diner floor itself. Ella didn't move. She just stood there, staring into the storm, whispering under her breath. Well now, who could that be? On a night like this, the sound of engines drew nearer, swallowing the silence, until it seemed like the storm itself had brought something with it. Something unexpected. Something that would change the course of her life and the entire town by morning. And that is where the story truly begins. The roar of the engines was no illusion. It grew louder, closer, until it drowned out even the thunder itself. Ella stood frozen behind the counter, her hand resting on the old coffee pot, her eyes fixed on the trembling window panes. Then sudden silence. The engines cut off all at once, leaving only the storm raging outside. For a moment, the quiet was even more unsettling than the noise. And then came the knock. It wasn't a polite tap. It was heavy, firm, a fist against wood that made the whole frame shudder. Ella glanced toward the door. The bell above it rattled nervously in the wind. Her gut told her most folks would lock the latch and pretend no one was home. But Ella had never been most folks. The knock came again. Louder this time. She walked slowly to the door, every step deliberate. With a steady hand, she pulled it open. There, framed by sheets of rain and flashes of lightning, stood 9 men. They were soaked through, leather jackets clinging to their broad shoulders, boots splashing in the puddles beneath them. Their cuts bore the unmistakable patch, Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club. Their faces were hard, weather-beaten, hidden behind beards, tattoos, and eyes that seemed to pierce right through the night. For an instant, time seemed to stop. The world outside whispered danger. Every warning voice in town echoed in Ella's mind. Don't trust men like that. Don't let them near your place. Trouble follows wherever they ride. But then one of them shifted, his lips trembling, not with anger but with cold. Another coughed, shoulders shaking from the downpour. And Ella saw something that cut through all the noise: human need. Her voice was calm, steady, almost defiant against the storm. "Get on in here before you catch your death." The men exchanged surprised glances. They weren't used to doors opening so not with their reputation. The leader stepped forward first. Tall, broad, his beard flecked with gray. He gave a slow nod. "Ma'am, you sure?" Ella folded her arms. "A storm like this, don't care who you are. Now either step inside, or you'll ruin my floors with all that water." For a beat, the bikers stood motionless. Then one by one, they filed in, shaking off the rain, boots heavy against the diner's tile floor. The smell of leather, oil, and stormwater filled the room. The bell above the door jingled softly as it shut behind them, cutting off the roar of the storm. Inside, the diner felt smaller, tighter. 9 men in black leather filled the space with an energy that made the old light bulbs seem to flicker. Ella moved behind the counter as though nothing was unusual, picking up a stack of mugs. "Coffee's hot, food's warm, take a seat." One of the younger bikers leaned toward another, whispering under his breath, "This lady's got guts." The leader, still dripping rainwater onto the floor, gave a faint smile just for a second, then gone. The townsfolk who had lingered in the corner booths went stiff. A couple put down cash and slipped quickly out into the storm, rather facing the rain than sitting across from the Hells Angels. Their whispers trailed behind them. "She's lost her mind. She's letting them in." Ella caught the words, but she didn't flinch. She stacked plates, poured coffee, and carried them to the nearest table as though she'd been expecting 9 bikers all along. "Sit," she said firmly. "Food tastes better warm, and I don't like wasting it." The men hesitated, but hunger has a way of silencing pride. Soon, chairs scraped against the floor as the group sat down, their massive frames crowding the booth. The rain hammered harder outside, rattling the windows like it wanted in. Inside, the clink of forks and the hiss of the coffee pot filled the silence. One biker finally spoke, his voice gravelly. "Nobody else would have opened the door. Not for us." Ella didn't look up as she refilled his cup. "Lucky for you, I ain't nobody else." A low chuckle rippled across the table. For the first time, the storm outside didn't feel like the only thing breaking through the night. But as Ella glanced out the window, catching the glow of passing headlights slowing down to stare at her diner, she knew the town had seen. Word would spread fast, and by morning there would be questions. Yet for now, she stood tall, watching 9 strangers eat in silence, knowing she had chosen kindness over fear, and though she couldn't have known it yet, that single choice was about to change everything. Because tomorrow, the sound of 9 engines would return, and this time, they would not be alone. The diner was no longer the same quiet shelter it had been an hour earlier. Now, it was filled with the heavy presence of 9 bikers' boots caked in mud, leather jackets dripping stormwater, tattoos crawling up their arms like living stories written in ink. Their cuts, with the iconic Hells Angels patch, seemed to dominate the air as much as their silence. They sat together in a long booth, shoulders pressed tight, eyes darting between the windows. The food, and Ella herself, forks scraped against plates, coffee steam curled upward, and yet the tension clung thicker than the smell of rain-soaked leather. In the far corner, a couple of townsfolk lingered, whispering just loud enough to be heard. "Lord have mercy, she's feeding them." One hissed, "Mark my words, trouble's about to start." Another replied, eyes wide with suspicion. Ella heard every word. She always did, but her face gave nothing away. She moved with calm determination, balancing trays of biscuits, fried chicken, and steaming bowls of stew. To her, it didn't matter what their jackets said. Storm or no storm, men were men. And hungry was hungry. She set down a plate in front of the youngest biker, a tall kid with nervous hands. He looked up, eyes half hidden under wet strands of hair. "Ma'am," he said quietly, almost unsure, "you didn't have to do all this." Ella met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Son, everybody's got to eat. Storm don't care what patch you wear." The leader, sitting at the end of the booth, let out a low chuckle. His voice was gravel, deep and commanding. "She's got more backbone than half the sheriffs we've dealt with." That comment made one of the men at the counter shift uncomfortably. He paid his bill in a hurry, shot Ella a worried look, and muttered as he left, "You're playing with fire." The door swung shut behind him, and once again the diner felt smaller, the divide between fear and faith stretching wider. Ella refused to let the silence turn sour. She reached for a stack of blankets she kept behind the counter, hand-stitched quilts, worn but warm. She draped one over the shoulders of a biker who had been shivering quietly in the corner. He stiffened at first, as though unsure what to do with a gesture so soft, so motherly. Then, slowly, his shoulders relaxed. "Thank you," he muttered, voice low but sincere. Ella gave a faint smile. "You're welcome. Don't think kindness'll run out here. I keep it stocked, like coffee." For a moment, even the storm seemed to soften, but the whispers from the town carried louder now. Word was spreading beyond the diner walls. People passing by slowed their cars to stare at the row of motorcycles gleaming under the rain. The glow of headlights lingered too long at the windows. Phones were lifted. Calls were made. Inside, The men ate in silence, though every few minutes their eyes flicked to the door, waiting almost expecting someone to barge in. Finally, one biker broke the silence. His voice was rough but tinged with disbelief. "You ain't scared of us?" Ella turned slowly, wiping her hands on a towel, her gaze steady. "I've been through too much life to be scared of a little leather and thunder. Storms don't scare me. People don't scare me, but letting fear turn me cold, now that, son, scares me plenty." The men exchanged looks, some smirking, some thoughtful. They weren't used to being spoken to like that, firm, honest, without judgment. One of them leaned back, exhaling smoke from a cigarette he hadn't even lit. "Most folks treat us like we're already guilty, like we're carrying trouble before we even sit down." Ella's voice softened. "Maybe you are. Maybe you're not. But right now, you're just men needing shelter. And this diner was built to keep folks warm, not to shut them out." The leader's eyes lingered on her, studying her the way a man studies someone he can't quite figure out. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "You're different, and different ain't easy." The storm outside raged on, hammering the glass like it wanted to break in. But inside, something fragile was beginning to take shape. Respect, gratitude. Still, tension clung to the room. The town's judgment hadn't gone anywhere. And in the quiet between clinking forks and crackling thunder, one thought pulsed through Ella's mind like a drumbeat. By morning, the real test would come. She didn't know if these men would bring gratitude or if they'd bring trouble in their wake. But she knew one thing for certain. Her choice tonight had drawn a line. And that line was already being watched by eyes beyond these walls. Ella poured another round of coffee, steady as ever, as the clock ticked closer to dawn. Because when the storm broke, this small town would no longer be the same. And neither would her diner. The storm still pounded outside, but inside Ella's diner, a new rhythm was taking shape. Forks scraping against plates, chairs creaking beneath broad shoulders. The quiet hum of a coffee pot refilling it was as though the world had shrunk down to this single room where strangers and storms collided. For the first time that night, the bikers weren't just shadows in leather. They were men with tired eyes, filling their stomachs with food they hadn't expected to find. Yet the silence lingered, thick as smoke, until one of them finally broke it. "Ma'am," said the youngest rider, glancing around. "This place, it feels different." His gaze had landed on the wall beside the counter. Rows of photographs stretched across it, sepia portraits, faded Polaroids, snapshots of birthdays, Sunday church gatherings, and soldiers in uniform. A lifetime preserved in frames. The leader set down his fork, eyes narrowing at one photograph in particular, a man in his prime, wearing a military uniform, standing tall with medals on his chest. He pointed with a calloused finger. "That your husband?" Ella followed his gaze. For a moment, her face softened, touched by memory. She nodded slowly. "Yes, that's my James. Fought in Vietnam. Came back with scars you couldn't see, but a heart that never quit." Her voice wavered just slightly, but her pride carried it forward. "He used to tell me, Ella, you don't judge a man by the dirt on his boots or the ink on his skin. You judge him by whether he keeps his word." The bikers grew still, listening. The storm outside became distant, as if even the thunder wanted to hear. Another biker leaned forward, his arms heavy with tattoos. "Sounds like he was a good man." Ella gave a faint smile. "The best. He taught me that kindness ain't weakness. It's strength. And it's the kind of strength this world needs more of." The men exchanged glances. For a moment, their hardened exteriors cracked. One of them shifted uncomfortably, then spoke up. "Funny, we get judged everywhere we go. Folks see our jackets and think we're monsters. But truth is," he paused, clearing his throat, "some of us ride 'cause it's the only family we've ever had." Another chimed in, voice low and rough. "I joined after my brother died. Didn't know how else to keep going. These men," he gestured around the booth, "they kept me alive." The leader finally spoke, his tone heavy with weight. "People think this patch means trouble. And sure, we've made mistakes. But loyalty, brotherhood, that's what it's about. No man rides alone." The younger biker's voice trembled as he added, "We ain't angels, ma'am, but we ain't demons either." Ella stood silent, absorbing their words. She saw past the ink, the leather, the scars. What sat before her wasn't just a gang, it was a circle of men clinging to the only bond that kept them standing. She placed a fresh pot of stew on the table, her hands steady. "Every soul carries a story, and every story's worth hearing. My James believed that, and so do I." The men lowered their eyes, humbled in a way they hadn't expected to feel. The storm outside raged, but here within these walls a new kind of storm was breaking. One of the bikers leaned back, exhaling a shaky breath. "You remind me of my mama," he whispered. "Haven't thought about her in years." Ella's lips curved into a soft smile. "Then maybe it's time you remember. A man who forgets where he came from, forgets who he is." For a long moment, silence filled the diner. But it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of men remembering pieces of themselves they thought were lost. The rain hammered on, but something inside shifted. The distance between Ella and these 9 men was no longer measured in fire. It was measured in stories, in memory, in humanity. Still, Outside those diner walls, the town was watching. Whispers were already spreading through the night, twisting kindness into suspicion, compassion into danger. Ella poured another round of coffee, her voice steady as she set the mugs down. Eat up, boys. Morning's coming fast. And with it, more than just sunshine. The rain had not yet stopped when word began to spread. In a town as small as Millstone, whispers moved faster than the storm itself. One diner, one grandma, and 9 Hells Angels. It was enough to set every tongue wagging and every curtain twitching. By midnight, the story had already reached the sheriff's office. The dispatcher leaned over her desk, phone pressed to her ear, scribbling down yet another call. Sheriff, she said nervously, folks are saying Ella's sheltering bikers at her diner. Some are worried they'll tear the place apart. Sheriff Hayes, a man graying at the temples, leaned back in his chair. He knew Ella, knew her grit, knew she wasn't the type to be intimidated. Still, the thought of Hell's Angels in his quiet town tightened his chest. Tell them to stay calm, he muttered. I'll handle it in the morning. The calm was the last thing the townsfolk felt. At Murphy's gas station, 2 farmers argued by the coffee machine. She's lost her mind, one said, inviting trouble into her place. Mark my words, those men will burn it to the ground. The other shook his head. Or maybe she just showed them kindness when nobody else would. That's Ella for you. Always did see the good in people. At the church hall, the whispers grew sharper. A group of parishioners clutched their coats, voices tight with fear. Bikers like that bring nothing but chaos. One woman hissed, we need the sheriff to put an end to this. But another voice spoke up, quieter yet firm. Didn't the good book say to welcome strangers? Maybe she's living it better than the rest of us. The divide deepened as the night wore on. Fear battled compassion. Suspicion clashed with respect. And through it all, Ella remained in her diner, unaware of the storm of judgment gathering beyond her doors. Inside, the bikers laughed softly, their voices muffled against the glass windows. The sight of hardened men sharing stew and stories felt strange against the backdrop of Millstone's unease. To Ella, it was simply human. To the town, it was something else entirely, a threat, or a lesson, depending on who you asked. Back at the sheriff's office, Deputy Mills paced the floor. Sheriff, we can't just sit here. What if they're planning something? Hayes rubbed his jaw. And what if they're not? Ella's handled tougher storms than this town gives her credit for. But the people are scared. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Then maybe the people ought to ask themselves why. Meanwhile, on the edge of town, a group of teenagers gathered near the railroad tracks, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Man, can you imagine? Real Hell's Angels. Right here in Millstone, one whispered. Another grinned. Bet they've got stories we'll never hear in this place. Even the curious couldn't resist the pull of the story. Every street, every home, carried a piece of the debate. Was Ella reckless or was she brave? By dawn, the rain had thinned to a drizzle, and the sky carried the pale light of a new day. But the air in Millstone was heavier than the storm clouds that lingered. People lined the sidewalks near the diner, not too close, but close enough to watch. Mothers held their children's hands tighter. Men folded their arms, whispering predictions of trouble. Inside, Ella wiped down the counter as the bikers prepared to leave. She could feel the eyes outside, the weight of judgment pressing in through the glass. Still, her back remained straight. Her late husband's words echoed in her heart. Never judge by appearances. Judge by the truth a man carries in his actions. The low rumble of motorcycles broke the morning silence. More riders were arriving. One by one, engines growled down the road until nearly 100 bikers lined the street in front of Ella's diner. Leather jackets, chrome glinting in the weak sunlight. The thunder of engines rolling like an army come to town. The crowd gasped. Fear rippled down the street like a wave. But Ella, standing at her diner window, didn't flinch. She saw not an army of strangers, but a sign something was shifting. Something bigger than fear. The town was no longer just divided. It was at a crossroads. And what happened next would decide more than Ella's fate. She tightened her apron, looked out at the sea of riders, and whispered to herself, James, I hope you're watching, because it's about to begin. Morning broke over Millstone with a weary silence. The storm had passed, but the town still bore its scars, branches scattered across roads, shingles torn from roofs, and puddles reflecting a sky that was finally clearing. The air smelled of wet earth and second chances. Inside her small home, above the diner, Ella stirred awake. Her bones ached, but her spirit remained steady. She rose before the sun, as she always had. Tying her apron around her waist like armor before battle, the memory of last night lingered in her mind. 9 strangers, feared by many, sitting at her tables like hungry children, warming themselves with bowls of stew. Their laughter had been low, their gratitude quiet, but their parting words still echoed in her ears. Ma'am, one of the bikers had said, his hand heavy on the counter, we'll pay you back someday. That's a promise. Ella didn't know if promises like that carried weight, especially from men whose lives were written in scars and tattoos. But she knew one thing: life had taught her to plant kindness like seeds, even if she never saw the harvest. So she lit the stove, brewed a pot of coffee, and prepared to serve breakfast to anyone who walked through her door. The first customers were regulars to farmers who eyed the empty tables with suspicion, still whispering about what had happened the night before. Ella greeted them with her usual warmth, pouring their coffee without a word of judgment. She had no intention of defending herself. People would think what they wanted. But just as she placed biscuits on the counter, something shifted in the air. A low rumble drifted through the streets, faint at first, then growing louder. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the storm returning, it was engines. Dozens of them. The windows rattled, the cups on the shelves trembled, and the ground itself seemed to vibrate beneath her feet. The farmers stiffened in their seats. Outside, townsfolk froze on the sidewalks, turning toward the sound that was building like a tidal wave of steel and fire. Ella set down the plate in her hand and moved toward the window. Her heart thumped in her chest as the first motorcycles came into view. Then another, and another, until the entire street was swallowed by chrome, leather, and the roar of engines. Not 9, not 20, more than 100. The sight was staggering, an endless stream of bikers rolling into Millstone, their headlights slicing through the morning fog, their jackets marked with the same emblem that had frightened the town only hours before. People gasped. Children clung to their mothers. A few men reached for their phones, ready to call the sheriff. But Ella simply stood tall, her hand pressed gently against the glass. The lead rider pulled up directly in front of the diner and killed his engine. The others followed, the street falling into a tense silence broken only by the ticking of hot engines cooling in the damp air. The man swung off his bike. He was broad-shouldered, his beard streaked with gray, his presence commanding without a word. Behind him, rows of bikers dismounted, their boots striking the pavement like soldiers assembling. Inside the diner, the farmers muttered under their breath. "This is it," one whispered. "They're taking over the whole town." But Ella turned to them, her voice calm. "Or maybe," she said softly, "they're here to eat breakfast." The bell above the door jingled as the leader stepped inside. The room seemed to shrink around him. He removed his gloves, his voice low but clear. "Ma'am," he said, nodding respectfully, "we came to keep our promise." Behind him, one by one, the bikers filled the diner. Booths, counters, every seat taken until Ella's little place looked like the heart of something much bigger than Millstone had ever known. Ella's hands didn't shake as she poured coffee after coffee, plate after plate. The men who once inspired fear now bowed their heads in thanks before lifting forks to their mouths. Laughter rose. Conversation flowed, and the diner buzzed with an energy that felt less like chaos and more like family. Outside, the townspeople watched in disbelief. Some still clutched their fear tightly, but others felt something unexpected stirring respect. The sheriff arrived, his car creeping through the crowd. He stepped out slowly, scanning the scene. 100 bikers, 100 reasons to expect trouble, and yet, inside the diner, all he saw was peace. He tipped his hat toward Ella, his lips curling into the faintest smile. She nodded back, as if to say, "I told you so." For hours, the diner overflowed with stories, laughter, and the clatter of plates. Ella moved from table to table, listening, smiling, serving with the same grace she always had, and though she didn't say it out loud, she knew in her heart the storm had passed, but its legacy was still unfolding. Something extraordinary was taking root in Millstone, something that would challenge every judgment, every whisper, every line that had divided the town the night before. The morning had brought more than sunlight. It had brought an army of loyalty, bound, not by fear, but by gratitude. And this was only the beginning. No one in Millstone had ever seen anything like it. The tiny town, usually quiet on a weekday morning, now shook under the weight of nearly 100 motorcycles lined, shoulder to shoulder, in front of Ella's diner. Engines cooled in the mist, chrome gleamed in the sunlight, and leather jackets flashed. The same emblem that once sparked fear in the hearts of the townsfolk. But this time something was different. Inside the diner, the air was electric. Every chair, every booth, every inch of counter space was filled with bikers. Their voices rose in laughter, their heavy boots clattered against the floor, and the smell of pancakes, bacon, and strong coffee mingled with the scent of leather and rain. Ella moved among them like a steady flame. Her hands were quick, her smile unshaken, and her spirit unbothered by the stares from outside. To her, this wasn't an invasion. It was a blessing. For the first time in years, her diner was alive. One of the bikers, broad tattooed, his beard flecked with gray, raised his coffee cup high. "To Miss Ella," he declared, his voice booming over the chatter. "The bravest woman we've ever met." The room erupted in cheers, mugs clinking, laughter rolling like thunder. Ella pressed a hand to her chest, touched but steady. "Oh, hush," she said softly, though her eyes sparkled. "I just gave y'all a warm meal. That's all." But to them, it was more than that. Much more. At the windows, the townsfolk gathered in disbelief. Mothers pulled their children close. Shopkeepers leaned in their doorways, shaking their heads. Some whispered warnings, "This can't be good. Nothing good comes from bikers." Yet others couldn't deny what they were seeing. The so-called outlaws weren't rioting. They weren't causing trouble. They were eating, laughing, and treating Ella like she was the matriarch of their clan. A young woman pressed against the glass. "Why, They respect her, she murmured. Her father pulled her back, but the words hung in the air. Back inside, one biker gently placed a photo back on the wall, the same one he'd admired the night before. It was Ella and her late husband, smiling in front of the very diner they now stood in. He looked over at her with a nod. He must have been a good man, the biker said quietly. Ella's smile softened. The best? He always told me to judge a book by its cover. Seems like he was right. The biker tapped his chest, where his jacket bore the Hells Angels patch. That's all we ask, ma'am, just to be seen for who we are, not what people fear. For a moment, silence washed over their table. Then another biker slapped the counter and grinned. Now pass the syrup before I waste away. Laughter broke the tension once more. Ella's niece, who had come in to help, leaned close to her. Auntie, you realize your diner hasn't been this full in years, right? Ella glanced around. Every seat taken. Plates emptying faster than she could fill them. And bikers leaving large bills ducked under cups and plates. More money than she'd seen in a week of business. She whispered back, almost in awe. Looks like the storm left me more than broken windows. The sheriff lingered in the doorway, arms crossed, watching carefully. He had come ready to break up trouble, but found himself standing in a room filled not with hostility but with family. He met Ella's eyes across the room, tipped his hat, and stepped back out. Outside, word spread quickly. What had begun as fear was shifting into something else: curiosity, even admiration. People whispered about the courage it took for Ella to open her doors. Others began to wonder if maybe they'd been wrong all along. As breakfast stretched into late morning, the bikers began filing out, shaking Ella's hand, thanking her one by one. Each man and woman left with a word of respect, a promise to return, and a loyalty that was impossible to ignore. When the last of the engines roared to life, the town was left in stunned silence. The diner windows rattled, but Ella stood steady. Her apron dusted with flour, her smile unshaken. For the first time in a long while, her little diner wasn't just a place to eat. It was a symbol, a place where walls between fear and humanity had cracked. And as the last bike disappeared down the road, Ella whispered to herself, guess the storm ain't over yet. It just changed its shape. Because deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. The sound of heavy boots echoed before the bell above the diner door even rang. Sheriff Whitaker didn't stroll in, he stormed in, hand resting on his holster, eyes sweeping the room like a hawk circling prey. His badge caught the light as he pushed the door open wider, letting the townsfolk outside peer in. He had come expecting chaos. He had come ready for it, but what he saw made him stop in his tracks. Instead of an all-out biker takeover, the diner looked like a family reunion. Plates of eggs and biscuits were half-eaten, coffee mugs were lifted in mid-toast, and laughter rolled through the room like a song. Ella moved gracefully between tables, refilling cups as though this were any other morning. And then he saw them, nearly 100 bikers, sitting shoulder to shoulder, filling every corner of the diner. Their jackets bore the Hells Angels emblem. Their tattoos marked stories he didn't want to know, and their presence was enough to make the sheriff's hand tighten on his belt. The laughter faded when they noticed him. Conversations died down. Forks set gently on plates. 100 pairs of eyes shifted toward the sheriff. The air grew heavy, charged with tension. All right, Whitaker said, his voice sharp. This ends now. I don't know what kind of stunt y'all are pulling, but Millstone's not your playground. Chairs scraped as a few bikers rose slowly, not in aggression but in defense. One broad-shouldered rider with a scar across his cheek stepped forward, his tone firm but respectful. Sheriff, we're not here to cause trouble. We're here because this woman saved us when the storm nearly tore us apart. Ella set her coffee pot down on the counter, her eyes steady as she met Whitaker's glare. They were stranded. Sam, she said, calling him by name. I wasn't about to let 9 men freeze or drown out there. You know better than anyone I'd have done the same for you. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He glanced at the townsfolk, crowding the windows, waiting for him to act. He wanted to believe her, but fear pressed on him like a weight. You don't know what they're capable of. Ella, he shot back. One of the bikers barked a laugh, low and bitter. And you don't know what we've been through. The room bristled, hands twitched, eyes narrowed. A standoff hung in the air, seconds away from tipping into something the whole town would regret. But then, the leader of the pack stepped forward, the same man who had first walked into the diner the night before. His voice was gravelly, his presence commanding. Yet his words carried an unexpected softness. We don't want your town, Sheriff. We don't want your trouble. What we want is to stand by the woman who showed us kindness when nobody else would. He turned, gesturing toward Ella. She didn't look at our cuts or our jackets. She looked at us like men. That ain't something we get often. The sheriff's eyes flicked back to Ella. Her hands were folded now, her chin lifted high. She wasn't afraid. She never had been. And slowly, Whitaker felt his grip on suspicion loosen. The bikers weren't circling like predators. They weren't posturing for a fight. They were protecting her, shielding her with their presence like an army defending a queen. A murmur rippled through the diner. One of the farmers who had been sitting quietly in the corner finally spoke up. Sheriff, maybe she's right. Maybe we're the ones who've been wrong. Outside, the townsfolk shifted uneasily. The wall between fear and understanding was beginning to crack. Whitaker took a long breath. Then, with deliberate calm, he removed his hand from his holster. The tension in the room eased like air escaping a balloon. He stepped closer to Ella, lowering his voice so only she and the bikers near her could hear. You sure about this, Ella? You sure they deserve your trust? Ella's smile was small, but steady. Sam, I ain't never been more sure of anything. You don't turn your back on people in need, not if you've got a heart left in you. For a long moment, the sheriff stood still. Then he straightened, turning toward the room. His voice was clear, carrying past the windows and into the crowd outside. All right, if Miss Ella says these men are good in her house, then they're good in mine too. The words landed like thunder. A sheriff's word was law, in a place like Millstone, and now, law had sided with compassion. The bikers exchanged glances, a few nodding in approval. The leader extended a hand toward the sheriff. It hung there in the air, the room silent again, waiting. After a beat, Whitaker reached out and clasped it. The handshake was firm, steady, unbroken. A bridge had been built, and though not everyone in town would cross it right away, the moment stood as a turning point, proof that even the heaviest of prejudices could bend under the weight of humanity. Ella returned to pouring coffee, as if nothing had changed. But inside, she knew everything had, because the storm had brought strangers to her door. And now, it was bringing her whole town to a choice, fear or faith. And the story was far from over. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in Millstone. For Ella, that echo came in the form of hammering, sanding, and laughter that rolled across her parking lot like music. It started one morning when she stepped outside, with her apron still tied around her waist. She expected silence. Instead, she found a dozen motorcycles lined up in the sun, chrome glinting like silver. The riders weren't sitting idle. They were working, climbing ladders, hauling wood, scraping paint off her walls. Her diner, the little place she had fought to keep alive for years, had become a construction site. Ella pressed her hand against her chest. Lord, what on earth are y'all doing? The leader of the angels looked down from the roof, a hammer in one hand, a grin on his weathered face. Payback, Miss Ella. You gave us shelter when we needed it. Now it's our turn to make sure you never have to worry about this place again. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned. She had fed them biscuits and coffee. She had offered them warmth. But this was something she never imagined. Inside, the diner smelled of fresh paint and sawdust. Bikers moved tables, patched cracks in the walls, and fixed hinges that had squeaked for years. One of them carefully replaced a broken jukebox light, flicking it on with a triumphant shout. Another rewired her old neon sign so that the word open glowed steady once more. The townsfolk gathered at the edge of the lot, watching in disbelief. People who had once whispered warnings now saw men in leather vests bending low to plant flowers in Ella's window boxes. The sight cracked something in the town's armor of suspicion. One farmer leaned toward another and whispered, "Never thought I'd see the day. Bikers did more for this place than we ever did." Day after day, the work continued. The bikers organized a fundraiser ride, roaring down the highway in a thunderous line of chrome and steel. They stopped at nearby towns, passing around hats and helmets, telling Ella's story to strangers. By the time they returned, saddlebags were stuffed with envelopes of cash, bills folded, coins, clinking. Ella tried to protest. She stood at the counter, with her hands on her hips, shaking her head. Now you boys listen to my didn't take you in, so you'd feel obliged. I ain't talking charity. The scarred biker stepped forward, placing an envelope on the counter, his voice steady but gentle. This ain't charity, Miss Ella, this is Brotherhood. You gave us more than a roof. You gave us dignity. That's worth more than we can ever pay back, but we'll try. He slid the envelope closer. Let us do this for you. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside, crisp bills lay stacked, more money than she had seen in months. Enough to pay off her overdue bills. Enough to keep the lights on. Enough to keep the diner alive. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She pressed the envelope to her heart. Lord have mercy. I don't know how to thank you. You already did, another biker said softly. That night you opened your door. Weeks passed, and the diner was reborn. The roof no longer leaked. The walls gleamed with fresh paint. The neon sign glowed like a beacon in the night. And every morning, Ella's parking lot was filled not only with the cars of locals, but with motorcycles from miles away. Her once struggling diner had become something more than a place to eat. It had become a symbol of kindness repaid, of bridges built, of brotherhood where no one expected it. On the day they finished, the bikers stood outside, their boots dusty, their hands rough from work. The leader handed Ella a final envelope, sealed and heavy. This one's for the future, for whatever comes next. Ella held it tight, her voice breaking as she said, "You men came into my life in the middle of a storm, and left me with more sunshine than I've had in years." The riders roared their engines in response, the sound echoing across Millstone like a declaration. The townsfolk, once hesitant, now clapped and cheered. Some even stepped forward to shake hands with the very men they had feared, and as the sun set behind the hills, Ella looked at her diner, her dream reborn in the hands of men who once seemed like strangers. She whispered to herself, "This ain't just my diner anymore. It belongs to all of us." But she didn't know that the greatest test of this newfound brotherhood was still on the horizon. The storm had given her family. The question was, could it withstand what was coming next? Some stories end with thunder, others with silence. But Ella's story, this story ends with the quiet hum of laughter, the clink of coffee cups, and the faint echo of motorcycle engines fading down the road. The diner was alive again. Plates clattered, the jukebox hummed softly, and sunlight spilled across the polished counter. Ella stood in her usual spot, apron tied neatly, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. But today, her eyes weren't on the register or the clock. They were on her grandchildren, sitting at a corner booth, wide-eyed and curious. Her eldest grandson leaned forward, his voice hushed but serious. "Grandma, why did they help you? Weren't people scared of them?" Ella chuckled softly, her gaze drifting toward the door where the last of the bikers had just waved goodbye. She took a breath, her voice steady but warm. "Baby, people are scared of what they don't know. They see leather and tattoos, and they think danger. But kindness don't care what you look like. It finds its way into hearts, even the ones that seem the roughest." The children listened closely. Forks paused halfway to their mouths. Outside, the sound of engines grew faint, like a storm drifting into memory. Ella continued, her voice carrying the weight of lived truth. "I didn't take them in to get anything back. I just saw men, cold and tired, standing in the rain. That was enough for me. And look what came of it. One small act of compassion turned strangers into family." Her youngest granddaughter piped up, her voice bright and innocent. "So, if we're kind, even to people who look scary, good things will happen." Ella leaned down, brushing a curl from the girl's forehead. "Not always right away, baby. Sometimes people won't return it. Sometimes they'll even take advantage. But kindness, real kindness, has a way of outlasting the bad. It plants seeds you might not see grow, until one day, you're standing in a room full of love where there used to be fear." Her words sank into the air, as steady and grounding as the smell of fresh biscuits from the kitchen. The townsfolk, who once peered in with suspicion, now filled the booths with easy smiles. Farmers, teachers, even the sheriff himself stopped in for coffee, nodding at Ela with respect. On the walls hung photographs taken just weeks earlier, images of bikers repairing the roof, repainting the walls, laughing at her counter. What had once been whispers of fear had turned into stories told with pride. Her diner was no longer just hers. It belonged to the community, built on brotherhood and second chances. That evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Ella stepped outside. She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the diner's porch rail. Across the lot, tire marks crisscrossed the pavement like signatures, reminders of the army that had come to stand with her. The air was still, broken only by cicadas in the distance. She closed her eyes, letting the peace settle in. And then she spoke, not to anyone in particular, but as if offering a prayer. "Thank you, Lord, for reminding me that kindness is never wasted." Her grandson joined her on the porch, slipping his small hand into hers. He looked up with innocent wonder. "Grandma, are you going to tell this story to everyone who comes here?" Ella laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Oh sugar, I don't need to. This place tells the story all by itself." And she was right. The neon open sign glowed against the twilight, brighter than it had in years. Through the windows, the diner pulsed with life, voices overlapping in warmth and joy. The place that was once on the brink of closing had become something eternal, a symbol of what happens when compassion pushes past fear. The camera lingers on Ella's face one last time, wrinkled but radiant, lined by years but lit by hope. She stands tall, framed by the diner she saved with nothing more than her courage and her heart. Behind her, the engines of distant motorcycles grow faint, carrying the sound of loyalty across the horizon. And as the screen fades to black, one truth remains. A single act of kindness can ripple outward, shattering walls of prejudice, rewriting stories, and leaving behind a legacy strong enough to outlast storms. Ella's legacy,